Hello, boys and girls. Now we're going to look at the second story in the packet for this week. This story is called Helen Keller's Lifelong Friend. Why don't you turn there with me now? Helen's early years. When Helen Keller was born, she was a beautiful, normal baby. There was no reason for her family to believe that she would be any different than any other girl born in 1880. But when Helen was 19 months old, she became extremely sick. She suffered a high fever. The doctors tried to help her. When Helen finally recovered, she seemed fine. However, her parents soon realized that there had been a huge change. So when Helen was born, she was pretty normal, but there was kind of one thing that happened that showed that she might not be. Can you underline what that thing was on your story? So the one thing that kind of showed that she was different is that she became extremely sick, and then she had a very high fever. And that was kind of what showed her parents that something might be wrong and might be different about her. Let's keep reading to see what that was. Helen's illness had left her both deaf and blind. Her mother discovered this when Helen didn't respond to people around her. By age 6, Helen was acting like a wild animal. She threw tantrums, she charged into people, screaming nonstop. She tore things up. She ate with her hands and took food from everyone's plate. Although her parents showed her affection, Helen left them exhausted. Relatives suggested that Kellers send Helen to live at a place for other children like her. Even though Helen was difficult and headstrong, it was clear that she was bright. She used her other senses to identify people and things. Helen's parents searched the country to find a doctor who could cure her. However, they found out that her blindness and deafness could not be reversed. So what problems did Helen have? Well, there were two main problems. She was deaf and she was blind. And then being deaf and blind caused her to have other problems. What were some of those problems? Well, she acted in a crazy manner. She was rude. She took food from other people. She would yell and scream and throw tantrums. Why do you think that might have been? Well, I think maybe it was a result of her being deaf and blind and just not knowing how to navigate the world around her. But it also might have just been because she was kind of a difficult person or a difficult child. Let's keep reading and see what happens to her as she grows up. Help finally came from an unusual source, Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. He suggested that Mr. and Mrs. Keller write to the Perkins Institution in Boston, Massachusetts. There, a young woman, deaf and blind like Helen, had been educated successfully. Helen's mother wrote to the school's director. He advised the Kellers to hire a young woman, Annie Sullivan, to become Helen's tutor. Okay, so they got some help from Alexander Graham Bell, who also happened to be the inventor of the telephone, and he told the Kellers that another woman like Helen, who was deaf and blind, was able to be raised and taught successfully. So then they reached out to this tutor for Helen, probably hoping that the tutor would be able to teach her how to act properly. And here is a picture of Helen Keller, who is on the left, with her tutor on the right, Annie Sullivan. Annie Sullivan meets Helen. Annie met Helen in 1887, just before Helen's 7th birthday. Within a short time, Annie and Helen formed a special bond and would become inseparable. They would go everywhere together until Annie's death almost 50 years later. Because Annie had poor eyesight herself, she may have understood Helen better than others. From the beginning, Annie recognized Helen's intelligence. She developed a method of teaching Helen words. She would spell a word in Helen's hand using a type of sign language. Then she would have Helen touch the object. Even though Helen learned to spell many words, she didn't understand what they meant. Helen's family thought that some of Annie's methods were harsh, and they often treated her as an intruder. But Annie saw how Helen terrorized her family. She convinced Helen's father to let them live in a cottage on the family's property. So Helen was not very nice to her family, even as she's growing up and getting older. But Annie is able to teach her something. She's learning how to spell some words, though she still doesn't really understand what those words mean. Annie moved Helen to the small enclosure where she was completely separated from everyone else. Although Helen continued to learn quickly, she still didn't understand words and their meanings. One day, Annie held Helen's hand under a water spout and spelled the word water. Suddenly, Helen understood that water and the liquid coming from the spout were the same. So this is a big moment of learning in her life. I'm actually going to underline what happened in that big moment where she finally was able to make a connection between the spelling of words and what they actually meant. What happened that helped her make that connection? Well, it was when Annie held her hand under the water and spelled the word water. Then she was finally able to understand what it meant. Beyond Alabama. In 1888, Annie and Helen left Alabama. On Helen's first trip away, she and Annie traveled to Boston to meet the students at the Perkins Institution. Helen and Annie spent the next 2 years at Perkins. At Perkins, with Annie's help, Helen learned to read lips using her fingers and to read books using Braille. Helen also began to write stories and poems. People learned about her ability to use her hands to talk. Newspapers even started writing articles about her. When Helen was 11, she had a short story published in a magazine. Little by little, she began to be paid for her writing projects, and she became more well-known. So now Helen is becoming more successful, and she's able to write some things, and her writing has even been published. So she is overcoming the problems that she had in being deaf and blind, and she is still finding ways to learn and to work. Now, Helen was eager for a real education. She wanted to go to school, but no school would take a student who was deaf and blind. Annie learned of a new school in New York City whose aim was to teach deaf students to speak. In some ways, while in New York, Helen was like any other student as she attended school, went on field trips, and explored the city. But in other ways, her life was very different. Because Helen was a celebrity, she met many wealthy and famous New Yorkers. How do you think Helen became a celebrity? Well, I think it's because as she's writing, people are finding out that she's deaf and blind, and then they're very interested in her and want to know more about her. Off to college. With Annie's encouragement, Helen's education continued. In 1900, she was accepted to Radcliffe College. She was the first deaf and blind person ever to enroll in a college. The classwork was extremely difficult. Annie coached and tutored Helen every step of the way. In 1904, Helen graduated. After graduation, one of Helen's plans was to inform the public about the lives of blind and deaf people and the challenges they faced. She began a series of essays that described how she used her senses to understand what was going on around her. So what was her main goal after graduation? She wanted to let other people know about the struggles of deaf and blind people. Why do you think that is? I think that it's maybe because she wanted people to understand her better, and maybe she wanted to be able to help other people who were like her to have better lives. Because I'm sure it was very difficult at that time for people who were blind and deaf. It is still hard for them today, but back then they wouldn't have had service dogs or hearing aids or all of the things that we have today to help people. Helen's causes. Until this time, people didn't know how deaf and blind people felt. Helen's essays made them more aware. In one essay, she wrote about how she could identify a person's age from the vibrations of the person's footsteps. As Helen grew more famous, people from all over the world asked her for help. Helen decided to become a public speaker for the blind. Annie rarely left Helen's side. She was Helen's voice coach and helped her prepare her speeches. Together, they went on lecture tours. When Helen gave a speech, Annie would give a short introduction, and then Helen would begin. At their first speech, Helen was terrified, but she adapted quickly. Her audiences loved her. Helen said she used her speeches to encourage people, especially those with disabilities. Although Helen was the star, Annie was the chief figure behind the scenes. Helen, with Annie's assistance, took up other causes. In New York, she began to write about the divide between the rich and the poor. She wrote about the immigrants and their challenges. Also, she was against segregation, or separation of blacks and whites. She became involved in women's suffrage, which was the movement for women's right to vote. So she was not only standing up for people with disabilities, but she was also standing up for African Americans, for immigrants, and for women. So all of these people who were mistreated by society as a whole, she was trying to help those people. Helen and Annie's last years. Over the years, Helen's writings had been Annie and Helen's means of support. Helen also became a spokesperson for the American Foundation for the Blind. This organization provided information, books, and education for people who were blind. Although many of Helen's views were considered radical or extreme, they helped draw attention to the foundation. The two women crisscrossed the country and later Europe on fundraising trips, giving speeches and visiting schools for the deaf and blind. Helen even spoke to Congress in support of a bill to provide public libraries for the blind. It was during this time that Annie became seriously ill. She died in 1936 at 70 years old. Annie Sullivan, whom Helen had always called teacher, had been Helen's companion since Helen was 6 years old. Can you imagine having a teacher who taught you from the time that you were 6 to when you were past being an adult and all grown up? That was amazing that Annie stood by Helen that long. And I bet it was really difficult for Helen having Annie pass away. Helen's later years. After Annie's death, Helen continued to travel. During World War II, she visited blind, deaf, and wounded soldiers in hospitals. Afterwards, she continued to be an important voice for people with disabilities. Helen Keller's life story became a successful Broadway play, The Miracle Worker. Annie Sullivan was more than Helen Keller's teacher. She unlocked Helen's silent and dark world by helping her communicate. She also remained a lifelong companion. Annie taught Helen so much, and by doing so, helped Helen teach the world even more. And here are some important dates in their life that show a timeline from when Helen was born to when she dies. And here are some activities that you can do with this story. This is comparing and contrasting Annie and Helen. So Annie, with her vision and hearing, Annie could help Helen communicate. That's something about Annie. Then we're going to write something about Helen over here, and then in the middle, something that's true about both of them. Here is a writing assignment. Write an informative paragraph describing a person you know whose life involved a series of interesting events. Describe these interesting events in detail. Use words such as first, next, and finally to make the orders of events clear. So it wants you to write a paragraph telling about someone's life. Maybe someone you know who kind of had an interesting or different life. It doesn't have to be as different as Helen Keller's was, but maybe just a couple things telling about their life and some of the interesting things that happened to them in order using those transition words. Over here we have our vocab words. You can write those in sentences, write the definitions, or you can draw pictures for them. And finally, I would like you to think about what is the theme of this story. What lesson can we learn from Helen Keller's life and from how Annie impacted her life? And you can go ahead and write that on your story as well. All right, boys and girls, thank you so much for taking the time to go through this story with me, for watching this video, and for doing this work with me together. Now we're going to look at the math for this week in our next video. Thanks.